All right, what's going on, guys? So in my last video, I explained how to set up your training after a layoff. In this video, I'm going to lay out 3 ways to set up your nutrition after a break so you can get back in shape as fast as possible. So listen closely to see which of the 3 best applies to you. The most common situation is what we can call anti-recomposition. You lose muscle while gaining fat. This is the exact opposite of body recomposition, which is what you'd normally want. And this is what usually happens if you stop training altogether or stop training as hard while eating in a caloric surplus. And if you're in this camp, don't feel bad. This is what happens to most people when they stop training. It's really hard to stay motivated with your diet when you don't have the gym as a driver of your dietary behavior. So when one goes down the tubes, the other tends to go with it. Now, the second possibility is pure muscle loss. This means that you lost muscle, but your body fat stayed about the same. This is usually what happens to people who are so-called hard gainers. So if you're already genetically lean and struggle building muscle in the first place, you'll tend to see more or less pure muscle loss when you stop lifting. A good example of this was Matt, the client of Cliff Wilson's that I highlighted in my video on muscle loss. He lost 35 pounds of pure muscle mass after 2 months in the hospital. And the coaching strategy that Cliff used to build all that muscle back super fast was really eye-opening, and we'll get to that in a minute. The third possibility is that you don't actually lose any muscle, you just gain some fat. Now, this is common if your training break wasn't quite long enough to see significant size loss, but because your diet was also off track, you still gained some unwanted fat, making your physique appear much softer and less muscular. Okay, so those are the 3 possible outcomes of what can happen to your physique after a training break. Pretty much all of you should fall into one of those 3 categories. All right, so first, let's assume that you lost muscle while gaining fat. I see a lot of people in this camp wondering if they should focus on losing the fat first by going on a cut, or by building the muscle back first by doing a little bulk while muscle memory is still in high gear. I actually don't think either of these approaches are the most effective way to get back in your best shape as quickly as possible. In this case, the best thing you can do is aim for body recomposition by building muscle and losing fat at the same time. Now, I've talked about body recomposition in detail in another video, so I'm going to cut right to the chase here. Out of the 4 scenarios where body recomposition is most common, we're currently dealing with an easy one: detrained individuals. Recomposition is very easy for people who've taken a break from training, regardless of previous training experience, because of the muscle memory effect. It's able to rebuild muscle at an unusually accelerated rate, more similar to a newbie lifter or someone using steroids. So to simplify the physiology a bit, the net effect is that the body can tap into existing fat stores to fuel the accelerated muscle building process, resulting in simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain. Okay, so recomposition is the best approach here, but how do we make that happen as quickly as possible? Well, the single best thing you can do is really make sure that your training is on point. I've got a free comeback program available on my website if you'd like to check that out. But diet is really no different. You need to have a plan in place from the outset. And we can set up our recomp approach as a 3-level pyramid with caloric intake at the bottom, then macronutrient intake, and what I would call the often neglected peak variables at the top. A caloric intake is simple. Just put yourself around theoretical maintenance, so the number of calories you'd need to roughly maintain your weight. And again, if you're not sure, multiplying your body weight in pounds by 16 should get you in the right ballpark, and then you can just guess and check from there. Now, macronutrient intake is a bit more involved. For quick recomposition, the first macro you want to prioritize is protein. Now, my advice for this may sound a little extreme on the surface, but I say to set your protein high and to then bump it a little higher. I'm actually serious. Research repeatedly shows that higher protein diets, and in some cases, ridiculously high protein diets, are simply better for body recomposition. Take this 8-week training study, for example. Researchers had one group eat a high protein diet and another group eat what I'd call a super high protein diet. After 8 weeks, both groups gained the same amount of muscle, but the super high protein group lost over 5 times the fat. So going higher on protein is definitely better for faster recomposition in that it allows for the leanest possible gains. And based on the literature as a whole, I'd suggest setting up your protein somewhere between 2.4 and 3.3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, or 1.1 to 1.5 grams per pound if you want recomp as fast as possible. Okay, up next, carbs and fats. Now, I'll say up front, my recommendations here are based more on my own coaching experience than the actual science, but for most people who've seen anti-recomposition, I do find that a higher carb, lower fat macro setup is more effective. There are a few reasons why this could be. This 2019 article from Examine argues that overeating with fat, even for just 1 day, translates to excess fat gain in a way that you tend not to see with excessive short-term overfeeding of carbohydrate. Now, this could be because fat is stored nearly exclusively in fat tissue, whereas carbohydrates are preferentially stored in muscle and liver glycogen, and then not easily converted to fat, especially in trained individuals. My speculation is that because glycogen is low after a training break, Once you resume training again, your muscles become something like a sponge for glycogen, which could explain why most people tend to see faster visual recomp with higher carbs and lower fats. Now, over the long term, I tend not to make a big deal out of carb to fat ratios. Some people do better with higher fats, some people do better with higher carbs, but since we're shooting for speedy recomp here, I think that a lower fat, higher carb approach is worth trying for yourself. If nothing else, research shows that it'll at least help support your training performance better. So I'd recommend setting your fats no higher than 20% of total calories with a max cap at 75 grams per day. So this should put just about everyone somewhere in the 45 to 75 gram range during the recomp comeback phase. Then once you've set your protein and your fat cap, you'll need to simply fill in the rest of your calories with carbs. All right, up next, the peak variables. Now this is where it gets really interesting to me. I personally think that factors like nutrient timing and meal distribution can make a difference when trying to recomp as fast as possible. Take pre and post workout nutrition, for example. Even though the science has made it clear that you don't need to time nutrients around the workout perfectly for that workout to be effective, that also doesn't mean you can just ignore pre and post workout nutrition altogether and still expect to optimize your rate of progress. Now, my rules here are pretty simple. Make sure your pre and post workout meals have at least 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight and at least 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, ideally including a fruit source. And then make sure those meals aren't separated by more than 4 hours. There are, of course, other things you can do, like make an effort to evenly distribute your protein intake across 4 or 5 meals per day, and make sure that you eat a high protein, high fiber meal before going to bed. I also think this is an instance where creatine loading makes sense, especially if you stop taking it during your break. So supplementing 20 grams of creatine monohydrate per day for a week will help saturate the muscle quickly, improving fullness faster, and then you can go back to taking the 3 to 5 gram maintenance dose from there. And in my opinion, these things that most people just ignore can be the difference between it taking a few weeks or a few months or longer to get back to your peak shape and beyond. Okay, so that covers the anti-recomposition case. Now let's take a look at what we should do in cases of pure muscle loss. Here the strategy is a bit different because we don't need to worry about losing fat. This time we just need to rebuild the lost muscle as fast as humanly possible. Of course, literally the fastest way to do that would be to just enter a huge caloric surplus. Just bulk on as many calories as you can safely stomach. And I think that's actually a legitimate approach for people who just want to get big fast and don't care about gaining fat. But in my experience, that isn't most people, and that approach tends to backfire anyway. That's because research shows that rapid weight gain from large caloric surpluses tend to result in a much higher proportion of fat gain than muscle gain. So yeah, you will be more massive, but it might not result in the muscular appearance that you're hoping for. So even here, we're going to need a more calculated approach than just the typical dreamer bulk. And since Cliff Wilson is one of the most successful pro natural bodybuilding coaches in the world, I decided to get him on the line to outline his nutrition approach for his client's 35-pound muscle regain. And he explained to me that he used a very aggressive, high-carb overfeeding strategy.
Yeah, even through this process, I guess high became sort of a relative term to me because I started him off at calories and macronutrients that I deemed as high, probably around 250 grams of protein per day, around 500 grams of carbohydrates per day. And Matt can't really go much more than about 35 grams of fat per day before his Crohn's disease starts giving him problems. So we were in that range, and I was like, he will surely start gaining weight very quickly on that. And he did initially, but as you said, his metabolic rate would increase as we were feeding him. He would gain for a while, and we'd actually see him hold or start to lose weight again. We just kept bumping it up. And finally, I told him a few refeed days of around 700, 800 grams of carbohydrates. And we did it for about 2 or 3 days, and we noticed his weight would hold steady or actually just inch up a little bit. So we were like, let's just stay on these numbers for as long as need be. And we ended up carrying it out for almost the entirety of the 2.5 months and until he was finally at a composition that we liked.
So keep in mind that everyone who experiences muscle loss is going to be able to tolerate that many carbs, but I have worked with plenty of clients who have these really adaptive metabolisms to the point that you really do need to just keep jacking carbs higher and higher to pack the muscle back on. So for anyone who's experienced pure muscle loss without significant fat gain, the best approach is to do a fairly aggressive short-term bulk until you get your lost size back while self-assessing your rate of fat gain. So here I generally suggest a 20 to 30% caloric surplus, or about 1% of weight gain per week. You may gain a bit of fat initially, but once you reach your old weight again, then you can put yourself back closer to maintenance calories and aim for body recomposition or lean gains from there. Okay, so the third and final possibility is that you gained fat, but you didn't actually lose any muscle. This is usually what happens if you've been training in some limited capacity. Now, let's say you were doing bodyweight workouts a few times a week, which was enough to maintain your muscle, but if your diet was also off track, you might look like you lost size because the fat gain is blurring your muscle definition. So even though you look smoother and flatter, your size is actually still there. In this case, I'd simply recommend running a mini cut. So you can put yourself in a 20 to 25% caloric deficit and aim to lose about 1% of your body weight per week for 4 to 6 weeks. So if you weigh 180 pounds on your mini cut, you try to lose about 1.8 pounds per week, which you could just set up as a range of 1.5 to 2. And then as long as your training is on point, you'll start to quickly notice your physique taking on a much tighter and harder appearance. And then once you're a bit leaner again, now you can bring your calories back up to maintenance and enter a lean gain or recomp phase from there. This way you'll improve your aesthetics much faster and be able to see your muscle gain as it happens without that extra layer of body fat covering it up. And guys, I know this was a lot of info all at once, so if you want a more action-oriented plan to put all this together, you can pick up my ultimate guide to body recomposition for 20% off for the next week. That includes much more of the specifics for pre and post-workout nutrition, sample meal plans, supplements, and there's even a full chapter on optimizing sleep and reducing stress in there. That's got over 15 chapters in total, and it covers everything from A to Z on body recomposition. So I'll put the discounted link over here next to my head, and I'll also put that in the description if you'd like to check that out. There's also 3 blog posts over on jeffnippard.com now, the latest one covering the science and more of the nuance behind this topic. So don't forget to leave me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys all here in the next one.